Bonjour à
Hello everyone, thanks a lot for being with us. You've come in droves in this amphitheater panel discussion about the role of Europe in the world order, world disorder. China, US, Russia, where should Europe stand? UK included, of course. It's a major issue. There's a trade war that is being announced with many developments. Trump is a protectionist ally, interventionist ally. Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, has taken a position, and it's a challenge, a strategic, political, economic challenge. Can Europe assert itself, or should Europe be subject to the headwind? And what about the custom tariffs that are being negotiated to the tune of 10% and not to the tune of 25%? But I can tell you that European products will be taxed even more. Those products that will be exported to the US. A very important panel discussion. In order to address this topic, I will give the floor to Christian Saint-Etienne. He will give us his vision, strategic and economic vision. What is the role of Europe? Christian, over to you. Thanks a lot. Hello, everyone. So, a 2-minute introduction. But of course, this topic would deserve to talk more. The US and China have been waging a conflict for many years, a conflict for global domination, geostrategic, economic, and strategic conflict, a total, an all-out conflict. The two powers together, they account 43% of global GDP and more than 55% of military expenditure globally. If you reassess the Chinese military spending, taking into account the European standards, we have two giants that are vying for global domination. And then you have Russia. Russia wants to reassert its position and its role in the global geostrategy, and especially because the Russian leaders are very familiar with the discussions that are going on in the United States. If Russia does not control Ukraine, Russia cannot become again a big power and be on a par with the major global economic leaders and players. So the fundamental question is, what is the role of Europe? What is the place of Europe at a time when Donald Trump grabbed power during the first term of office? He didn't change the world order that was built by the United States after World War II. The US for 7 decades have built a global international order. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 to sort out monetary problems. The US didn't want to have a repeat of the monetary wars that we got after the Great Depression, with lots of currencies being devalued, the pound in 1931, the dollar in 1934. So the Americans wanted to avoid a repeat of these monetary disasters. They created GATT in order to create an international trade order. In between, you had the San Francisco Conference that played a key role, especially if you take into account the discussions that we will have, the Declaration of San Francisco upon the initiative of the United States. All the countries should get the same rights, whatever their size. In this context, against this background, the Americans have built a global order in order to serve their interests. Let us not be naive, but it was an international order that was open. Japan, Germany managed to rebuild, they managed to export. The Western countries and some countries managed to develop themselves, some countries from the former Third World. But with Donald Trump, there's a tipping point. He considers that the role of the United States being a creator of the world order, it's a burden for the United States. And Donald Trump would like to adopt what we call an imperial model, i.e. the US, in contradiction addition to the San Francisco Charter and the article, the US will assert their power vis-à-vis the small countries, and the Americans are striking their allies and much more than their adversaries when you consider the trade war. So Europe doesn't benefit from the protection from the United States, and Europe is in a situation whereby the United States do not protect Europe anymore, but the US is being an aggressor. China is leading an expansionist policy in the field of industrial matters. So China represents 31% of manufacturing production, but Xi Jinping recently, of course, we could think that China could reduce its weight in the global industry. Xi Jinping has set an objective, 35% of industrial production in the world by 2030. So just around the corner. So how Europe can get its geostrategic political balance? How can Europe reorganize itself, especially if you consider the current context? So Europe was the best student of the international order built by the United States, and Europe is like a set of countries being challenged amongst themselves. And Donald Trump said repeatedly during the election campaign, and once elected president, he said that he wanted the end of the EU as such. Thanks a lot, Christian. A big round of applause. Very interesting, isn't it? So we've set the framework. We have high-caliber experts from Europe, the United States, UK, and from France. Creon BUTLER, the head of Chatham House. It's a very prestigious think tank, Global Economy and Finance Program. Hi, Creon. A round of applause to Creon as well. We have Jacques POMMERAUD, the CEO of INETUM. Jacques. Hi, Jacques. Hello. Right. Aurore LALUCQ, Member of Parliament, President of the Commission of Economic Affairs of the European Parliament, from the Social Democrat Group, SPD. Sabine DANDIGUIAN, Managing Director of Jeito Capital Investment Fund in Therapeutic Innovation. Big round of applause as well. And our American friend coming from the United States, Kim RUHL, from the Council of Economic Advisors, coming from Washington. Since February 2025, he's been the advisor for economic affairs, advisor for the ministers in charge of tariffs and customs-related issues. Big round of applause to him as well. Creon BUTLER, I will give you the floor immediately. What is your vision following the challenges that were posed by Christian Saint-Etienne?
Apologies for speaking English, but I think it will make more sense if I do. And secondly, thanks to the Circular des Economies for inviting me today. So I wanted to make 3 points in my 3 minutes. Firstly is the scale of the shock we've seen to the global economic system since the start of this year. I think you can put it into 5 things. Firstly, on the tariff side, we don't know where we're going to end up, but probably with a US tariff rate, maybe 10 to 15%, maybe 20%. That compares with an average tariff rate of just 2.5% last year. Also, the US government at the moment doesn't follow any WTO rules and has ignored 20 bilateral free trade agreements in the policies that they've adopted. Secondly, on the dollar and the financial system, you have another 3 trillion plus on US public debt. You have the president's approaches to how he's going to appoint the next president of the Federal Reserve. This has major implications for the future role of the dollar. Thirdly, global public goods. The US has withdrawn fundamentally from the fight against climate change, public health, poverty reduction. Fourthly, and this is one that's not so often looked at closely, the US government has said they will no longer enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. They will no longer enforce rules on beneficial ownership transparency. And then you have a whole string of developments within the US, which really undermines global economic governance more broadly. And then finally, you have the security issues, which have also a major economic effect. So this is an enormous shock. There is, I think, to some extent in the UK, a sense of denial about how big that is. I don't get the sense in France, and perhaps not in Europe. But then there is a question of, well, what do you do about it? And I think the first thing is to say it's not going to go back. There is going to be a change. There may be a future US government that is more friendly towards the global system, but it's never going to go back to where we were before. And in response to that, we have to look for a very clear international concept, if you like, an international framework. There are, in particular, we have the US, we have China, and to some extent, most of the debate is focused on, well, if it's not the US, it has to be China. In fact, the logical center for another economic pole in Europe, in the world, is Europe, because Europe, after the US, is the next biggest economic trade bloc with close to 20% of world GDP. It's the largest exporter of goods and manufactured goods and services. The euro is 20% of world foreign exchange reserves. So fundamentally, Europe would need to be at the core of another economic pole between the US and China. And the risk I see, and this is my final point, is that so much focus is going into how we respond to Trump. What do we do internally? Not enough is going into how do we create that pole, which then will serve not just European interest over the longer term, but the broader international interest.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thanks a lot. Second speaker now, Sabine DANDIGUIAN, Managing Director of the investment fund Jeito, specializing in health-related issues. Jeito was created 20 years ago. No, Jeito is younger, but we've been working with some partners over the past 20 years. You've been working in the field of healthcare, in the field of industry, but how do you take up this challenge for Europe? Thanks a lot for the invitation. My approach will be a sector-based approach, and it will highlight what is going on amongst the great powers. Global health is globalized, and there are lots of geopolitical tensions regarding health. I will try to contribute to the debate. What do we see in the field of health with the undeniable power of the United States and the ramp-up of China at a time when Europe was the second leading player? What are the assets of Europe in the field of therapeutic innovation, the creation of new medicines, and a few avenues of solutions to be advocated at a European level? Regarding Jeito, Jeito is a fund, a young fund, a relatively young fund. We have some founders and partners that are well seasoned in health. Jeito has been founded European startups, for the most part, that will create the medicines of tomorrow through the great science they can tap. So I hope that I will be able to lend my contribution to the debate. And health is globalized, but there's a kind of bipolarization. The United States, with extremely capitalistic system, with university and pension funds that are powerful big laboratories that are marketing their products in the world, exceptional research, a system that takes risks, and financing therapeutic innovation. China is ramping up. China supplied raw materials and commodities. China is becoming a clinical development body. They publish scientific papers at a high level, and we've seen that China has ramped up because of a big domestic market. Nonetheless, there is no big Chinese laboratory able to market therapeutic innovation throughout the world. What about Europe now? Europe has lots of assets to tap in the field of healthcare in this specific market that is illustrative of what should Europe do. Europe has a good science. If you look at the rankings of the top research universities, amongst the top 143 universities are European. We embed Great Britain and Switzerland as bigger players in the pharmaceutical environment. Europe is a big market welcoming therapeutic innovation. Bear witness what happened during COVID. So we were able to stand shoulder to shoulder when there are public health issues. Health is a common good for the Europeans and beyond, and it's a primary good. Health is a primary good, something that we shouldn't forget. And of course, there are big pharmaceutical companies, Sanofi in France, Glaxo and AstraZeneca in Great Britain, Roche and Novartis in Switzerland, the big Nordic companies, Lundbeck and Novo, to name a few. But these companies play a key role. These big pharmaceutical companies, and the big pharmaceutical companies can sell the big drugs, the significant medicines. And I think that Europe should regroup. And Europe has lost its place. But during COVID, Europe managed to buy packaged goods, packaged medicines, and that's why the first vaccines were made available to different people. There are some pieces of good news. Healthcare is a strategic sector and can create value. In France, you have BPI, the Public Investment Bank. Nicolas Dufour called for many independent funds that could be created. This is the case of Jeito in order to fund therapeutic innovation. EIF, the Public Investment Bank and the European Bank are catalysts, and they provide some support to Jeito, and they catalyze necessary investment. Then mobilization of private saving. We have the TB initiative in France, whereby it was possible to label big investment funds in biotechnologies, in technologies, with the support of the major insurance companies, so they managed to provide funds. This initiative is coming down well in Europe. Will this initiative be expanded? Will this initiative be able to mobilize private funds? So you've said that China has no big laboratory able to export major medicines. Why is it the case? You know that healthcare is a resilient topic. You cannot become an inventor of medicines for quite a long time. They've tapped raw materials. They are making strides in terms of value creation because they can conduct clinical studies to then simplify. It's not really complex. Science, it's a matter of finding new ways of treating cancers, how to mobilize your immune system to combat cancerous cells. Then it's a matter of making a medicine, and Jeito is ramping up. Today you can't say, I've treated cancer. You have to transform the try. You need to prove the value that you will provide, and then the medicines will be made available. In terms of science, China is making some strides. It's a fast-track process with support of the public system. It's the public system versus the big American system, but China is not yet in a position to market globally because you need to get commercial power, regulatory power, and the Europeans and the Americans have those expertise and those skills. But Aurore, LALUCQ, you are a member of Parliament. You are the chairwoman of the Economic Affairs of the European Parliament. When you hear about Europe under the diktat of Trump regarding Trump's tariffs, what is your take on that, and what is your vision for the Europe of the future faced with China and the United States? So where should Europe stand? Question mark. I think that Europe has an avenue to tap because the United States, they were an imperfect country, but United States boiled down to democracy, defense, economics. So in the imagination of many people, should there be a problem in life, I can always go to the United States. This situation might not be perfect, but I can go there. But this tenet collapsed, and I think that Europe can tap this card. Of course, you have democracy, you have rule of law. The rule of law is being respected. In Europe, there's some stability. You can launch economic projects. So Europe has some assets to tap. Can Europe replace other big powers? Of course, Europe has an incredible economic power, unbelievable researchers, savings, but unfortunately savings being earmarked to the United States. But with the Union on Capital Markets, we hope that savings will be repatriated to Europe. We can do it. But can we do it? Should we do it? Do we want to do it? That's complex. Christian Saint-Etienne described many reasons for that, and Europe was built in some specific conditions, and Europe finds it difficult to move away from its comfort zone. But when we look at the situation, what is it like today? Has Europe changed fundamentally in terms of rhetoric, in terms of doctrine? Is there a systemic doctrine? The US, Russia, China, they have a systemic doctrine, but unfortunately Europe does not have a systemic doctrine. Has Europe got a strategy? Unfortunately not. Have we implemented the full Draghi report? Unfortunately not. We simplified things because Europe is a normative power with lots of standards, and Europe is specializing in the rule of law. The question of investments, the question of industrial policies, have we moved forward? I'm not going to lie to you. I've been fighting for that. We haven't made headway. We can talk about these issues. Industrial policy was a taboo word as part of my latest office. Can we say what is our strategy? We cannot do that yet. We are arming ourselves, the Europe of defense, with RUHL Glucksmann. I mean, we wanted to get European defense, but rearmament is good, but we need to get the right communication tools, otherwise it won't suffice. You have to consider the monetary infrastructures. I mean, we don't have any European means of payments. All our data are in the US, so we depend a lot on the Americans for all what is connected with digital. We are very weak because our democracies, I mean, can be impaired and attack. Have we made headway? Not yet. So what about the member states? I mean, the member states, are they less selfish than in the past? Not yet. We want to get a union of capital markets, but at the end of the day, when you are at the negotiating table, and I'm presiding over some negotiations, Germany will defend its interests, France and Italy will defend their interests, and it will be very difficult to get some trade-offs, and we are clinging to our own turf, and what would be a good idea would be to get a bigger cake. But Europe has a place to tap, but we need to get that place. And what is important is the balance of powers. But if you look at the balance of powers, you have the Commission, from the European Commission to the European Parliament, instead of having a position to get a transition from the EU to the US. There will be some negotiation on custom tariffs. We'll see if Europe can take this role, a 10% tariff. I can tell you that some companies will be nipped in the bud. If you have a 10% tariff, we won't have one. This is something that we need to bear in mind. And Trump does understand only one thing. He is not a transactional, he is an extortionist. What he likes is the power play, and Europe wants to have a role to play, and Europe should fight for the Europeans, and Europe should fight for his role and place. Otherwise, nobody will give Europe the place it deserves. Thank you.
Beaucoup de constats.
So, you've said a number of somewhat worrying things, given that there's not a lot of time before agreement needs to be reached. You're saying that 10% would be a failure, but that looks like what we're heading for. So, in terms of this trade war, will Europe have to submit? No, no one has to submit. No one can force anyone to submit. We need to know what our strategy is and how we can stand up for ourselves. We've got entrepreneurs right throughout this marquee. Ask them if 10% is nothing for them. I was at the agricultural fair in Bourget outside Paris. That's 10% would kill a lot of companies. Another question, is there a European strategy in dealing with Trump? It seems like people are kind of making it up as they go along. What is Europe doing? Europe is working hard 24 hours a day, but standing facing up to Trump, what is going on? It's not just Europe, it's the member countries. People say we need to negotiate tough, stand tough against the Trump, but what about financial services? No. What about this? No. What about olive oil? What about all of these different products? Member states themselves are very nervous about what it could mean to them. So the only thing that is positive in all of this is that Trump hasn't been able to divide us, and that's what he was trying to do. I'm not sure that the story's over yet. We're not out of the woods. Let's turn to Jacques, who is Chairman and CEO of INETUM. Tell us a little bit about INETUM, your group. It's not very well known. INETUM provides IT services. We have 28,000 consultants in different countries. Our role is to install technology in businesses and in government services and to make it work. So you're an entrepreneur. You've got a global vision. What would you say? How would you answer the question? Where should Europe stand? My answer will be about technology. Europe's place will depend on its power. Power is a term that we've been taught not to use very much for the last 60 years, because once we started to use power the last time around, we did stupid things with it. Power comes from wealth creation. Wealth creation, the money that we create, enables us to buy arms, to negotiate and trade. It gives us credibility and strength. As the Draghi report shows, part of Europe's power will depend on technology, and that explains why we're lagging behind in terms of wealth creation per capita, the lag that we have in terms of technology. So I've got three things to observe and three things to propose. The first thing is that the European market is very fragmented, whether we're talking about standards or working methods. The effort is the same for a French startup to start working in Germany as to move into the United States. And there's a kind of sovereign preference in each of the countries. If instead of that we had a market that was like the US market, which was a single unified market, we think that there would be 35% growth for European SMEs. What's happening? We're getting a brain drain, and even the businesses are leaving Europe. 30% of unicorns founded in Europe since 2008 have left. They've left because they're looking for greater return on their capital invested in a bigger market. So here's a proposal. We should talk about the 28th state. Because we are struggling to agree, we should create a 28th virtual state where companies could register, and there is a single set of tax rules, of regulations that would be valid for all of Europe. Sorry, you're saying something really important. The 28th state, is that your idea? It's an existing idea. Is it realistic? Is it? Is it a realistic idea? It's a really interesting thing for people listening to us. It's something that is being negotiated on a European level, not in terms of tax affairs, but we are working on the idea, and a report on this matter was filed in front of the European Parliament yesterday, in fact. So the second thing I'd talk about is our precautionary principle. It's helped us for many years as European countries. That's led us to develop a ex-ante regulatory framework. An example is the AI Act. It was created before AI came to the market. It was created in a theoretical basis. Other approaches would allow things to develop and would regulate after the event, ex-post regulation. So adoption, take-up of technology by businesses and public authorities is lagging behind. Let me give you a few figures. Cloud technologies, whereby data is stored on remote servers. This is a 15-year-old technology. Only 40% of European business use cloud technologies. The figure is a lot higher in the US and in China, and has been for many years. The second thing is the number of SMEs and bigger businesses who exceed the minimum digital threshold, a website and digital services. 40% of businesses in Europe don't have this minimum technological threshold. And now, if we turn to AI, the theme of the moment, if you look at all European countries and businesses with 50 employees, there's 13.5% that use AI. 40% of similar companies use it in US, and 50 to 60% in China. So, as a number of business leaders have said this week, we wonder whether we should have a moratorium on the enactment of some of the legislation like the AI Act, and we should move towards an ex-post regulation system rather than ex-ante regulation system. And for small and intermediate businesses, we need to encourage champions and encourage businesses to adopt a new technology, because that's what's going to create growth. Third observation is about talent. Just a few figures. If you look at the number of cutting-edge researchers and data scientists who are experts in AI, 10% of them live in Europe, 18% of them live in China, and almost all the rest of them are in the United States. More generally, we're talking about very specific skills there, but the number of working people in the general population are 4.6% of active population and 8% in the working population in America. So there's a real issue in terms of encouraging people, steering talent towards technology-heavy sectors. It's not about people being computer scientists or coders. It's a sign or a symptom of the lack of prioritization of the key sectors. It's something we can do. Let me give you some proof of this. In Singapore, from primary school, they teach engineering sciences. So we have just as many Singaporean women as men in tech sectors, because from 5 or 6 years old, little girls and little boys learning to code and to do robotics. Poland, which is nearer to us, a few years ago put in place a talent development strategy focusing on data. They've got 500,000 data engineers in Poland who are known for data engineering sciences. There are people from Poland, a number of people in key posts within OpenAI. So we really need to think about talent. It requires lifelong education system which focuses on and encourages tech. We need also the stability of our tax system, because these people want to live and earn a living if they work in tech in Europe. Thank you very much. That's been really interesting as well.
Notre ami américain qui évidemment...
Our American friend, who I'm sure wants to respond to everything that's been said. I just want to remind everyone that Kim RUHL, who is with us, is one of the members of the Council of Economic Advisors working with the White House, one of the economic advisors to the US presidency, and we're really keen to hear what you have to say about this question that's been raised. Over to you, Kim.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. Let me start with a very simple statement. The US values a strong Europe, and it values a strong transatlantic alliance. The US and Europe, believe it or not, have many common goals. Secure supply chains, reliable electricity, national and economic security. These are shared values. We also face a lot of the same challenges from non-market economies and global competitors who don't share our values. It's a good place to start, but a static policy is not the best response to a changing world, and the world is changing. This is not the 1960s, this is not the 1970s, it's not even the 1990s. The global economy has become unbalanced, and the US has found itself as the shock absorber, the one who's taking all of the excess capacity from non-market economies. It's losing its industrial base. And the president has taken action to rebalance that economy. Dramatic action, as many people here have discussed. And it's working to rebalance that economy and ensure that the United States can produce the goods that it needs to protect itself, to protect its allies, and to support the global trading system. And it's shown itself already as being willing to do that. In the short run, some of these policies are going to cause some volatility and they're going to cause some uncertainty, and that's uncomfortable. And change is uncomfortable, but as we've sort of seen here today, change is also a time for opportunity, including an opportunity for Europe. But not to get hung up on the short run, we're looking forward to a future with a stronger United States and a stronger Europe. And to get there, the US and Europe should continue working together on economic and geopolitical policies. When the US is strong and Europe is strong, then we can rebuild and we can build a transatlantic relationship that will be long-lasting. And as Europe continues to look outward in this session to see what is its place in the world, we've heard a lot about what Europe needs to do internally as well. And so I think what we would like to see is a Europe that looks inside, becomes a stronger Europe, and becomes a counterweight with the United States against the two other names on this panel where there's no one here represented, China and Russia. We're here, and we're here to have this discussion. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Peut-être vous.
Are there any responses? Perhaps let's go back to our friend from Chatham House. Would you like to respond to what's just been said? Should Europe have to choose between China and the USA, or is there a third way? What would you like to say to everything that you've heard on this panel so far?
I think the first thing I'd say is, I mean, I hope Kim is right, but many things that the president says aren't really consistent with what he said. I mean, particularly when you look on the security side, I mean, the president has threatened the sovereign territory of not just Canada, but also Greenland, which is part of, which is sovereign territory of Denmark. So this is not something you do vis-a-vis countries that you intend to have a long-term relationship with.
Can I have just a reaction here? Can I have a reaction? It's not purely economy, but it's interesting to see what you say.
Look, the US and NATO just came together on a 5% GDP deal to help strengthen the North Atlantic Alliance. That's not something that would have happened without the nudge of the United States. And again, I'm sorry if it's uncomfortable, but we're working towards moving us to a better place. A few months ago, the United States sent significant effort, putting its own people at risk, to open the Red Sea to trade. The US doesn't see the Red Sea, or the Red Sea is not an important trading route for the US. The Red Sea is an important trading route for Europe. And it was the US that did that, and it's the US that still is here to do things like that. And so I don't see that, sure, there's some rhetoric and there are some things that have happened, but if you look at our actions, we've done several things in order to try to keep this transatlantic alliance working and to try to keep Europe as part of the global economy.
Creon, your reaction?
Well, I think we could debate this, but you know, words are important. I mean, the second point I'd make is the system we had up to now actually worked really well in terms of developing the global economy, reducing poverty, and so on. It certainly needed change, and certainly there were ways in which, for example, China abused parts of the system, but then other countries did as well. The point is that the bulk of it, most of us want to preserve. We want a rules-based trading system. We want low tariff rates. We want development finance. We want to tackle climate change. We want to tackle global health threats. The US doesn't want to do that at the moment, so the real challenge for the rest of the world is, between the US and China, is how do we build an international system that achieves that preserves much of that system.
How do we do it? Comment on fait?
Well, there you
go ahead.
I think the core of it is it goes to Europe. This is what, because Europe is the only big economic bloc with those kind of values. China isn't that, and currently the US isn't that. So it goes to Europe to provide that leadership, to work with other big emerging economies, with other advanced countries. I mean, particularly between the EU and the UK, it's much stronger if they work together than if they work separately. And that, for me, is the thing I really worry about now, that, as I said at the start, we're not putting enough effort into preserving the bits of the international system that we all need in the future, even if neither the US nor China is willing to put the effort into that.
Il y a une question qui est posée importante, c'est est-ce que l'Europe...
There's an important question that's raised. Can Europe face up to these two giants if it is disunited? So we can see in very important issues such as defence and tariffs, and I'm asking a question to the MEP who's with us, who knows the European Commission well. Can Europe find its path if it's not united? Do you think this unity is possible, or will we see Europe fragmenting given all of the disunity that's around with different camps within the European Union? In some ways, that's what Donald Trump was looking to do. He was trying to disunite us, and that's not worked. That's a positive thing, as I've said. Just a bit of a response to what I've heard about we want a strong Europe from the part of our American colleague. I'm very sorry. I'm very surprised to hear this discourse. I would refer to that as a bit of a toxic relationship, because when one respects one's partner, one doesn't impose tariffs in such a unilateral way. One doesn't put on pressure to this extent. One talks differently. But that's the reality. I'm just responding to what's being said. I think we should talk differently to our partners, because the way that some American diplomats talk to some people is unacceptable. I need to say that. Let's give Kim the opportunity to respond. Just wait. I'd like to give Kim the chance to respond. Kim, would you like to respond to what's just been said?
Yes, I would. The actions of the United States didn't come from a vacuum. They're a response to things that have happened in the world, including in Europe. And if we're going to pick particular examples, the European Digital Services Tax, a very carefully crafted tax meant to only hit US firms, ones you've all heard of, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, who are here selling things in the United States, or selling things in Europe, that are already subject to the VAT, is now being used as a piggy bank by the EU to help fund their governments.
Sur le style, le style, la députée vous disait le style. Comment on parle à des amis, à des alliés? Est-ce qu'on leur impose des choses ou est-ce qu'on négocie avec eux? Le style est brutal.
Sorry, the style is brutal. In terms of the style of talking, what would you say to the MEP?
The way Donald Trump speaks to the Europeans. He doesn't negotiate, he imposes everything.
I'm not going to speak for the president. The president speaks for himself.
No, but you understand the frustration of the Europeans.
I do, and I understand the frustration of the Americans also.
Okay.
On peut être frustré après être incorrect.
One can be frustrated, but being impolite and brutal is different. So let's be very clear in what we say. That's the first thing to say. With respect to the Digital Services Act and so on, yes, we do have rules. We're not a US colony. We don't have the same rules as you. you'll have to accept that. You have to get used to it, whether you like those rules or not. We are a union, and we've decided together to protect our citizens in some ways, and they're the ones who will decide whether we have the right rules or not through what we call elections. Jacques Pommeraud, I want to come back to you. You're not in this very lively debate. How do you perceive this debate? Can you understand the response of Aurore and Kim? Yes, part of my work is to negotiate deals, so I understand the tactics and different negotiating styles and the different purposes that are sought in the long term. But to come back to a technological point, there's an issue around sovereignty. Should we prefer sovereign solutions for any of our applications? Figures would show today that this doesn't seem to be a priority for European clients. From what I can see amongst European countries, whether it's public authorities or private businesses, a large part of the investments are going to those companies that were mentioned, Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and so on, for different reasons. So our work is to advise our clients how they can secure their infrastructure on a technological point of view and how they can protect themselves against cyber attacks. Did you hear that all of Visa's data is held in the USA? What do you think about that? Yes, if you use Visa, if you use Instagram, if you use WhatsApp, if you use TikTok, it's a reality. The data is hosted in the USA. So if you're a business, the question is, do I have the right conditions to operate in a secure way? Let's not forget what we're talking about with cybersecurity. Let's talk about real risks. Perhaps someone might cut off my access to Microsoft. That's a theoretical thing, but the reality is that 1 business in 8 has had a cyber attack. This year in France, it's 15 billion euros in costs for French businesses. If cyber attackers were a nation, they would be the 3rd biggest world economy. And that's from countries that are represented here. It comes from criminal groups. It's a real risk. So I think let's stay concrete in what we're talking about rather than imagining theoretical scenarios. Before we hand over to Christian Saint-Etienne to give us a wrap-up, let me come back to Sabine to talk a little bit about health. You talked about the power of American innovation in health and the pharmaceutical industry. At the same time, Trump is taking major decisions in terms of cutting budgets. Will that affect the US innovation capacity and power in this field? What do you think? Thank you very much. I understand all of the frustration and tension here on the stage. Health is an area in which we need to take a global approach, and perhaps what's going on in the USA with the America First approach offers an opportunity for Europe to put itself first and build its strength. Healthcare is a strong sector in Europe, so yes, in USA there are big pharmaceutical companies, there are big pharma companies in Europe. There's a lack of funding. Will these European pharma companies be hit by US tariffs? Well, let's wait for the implementation. There's a difference between the words and the actions, but the important thing to say is that the cuts to US academic budgets might hold back some research. That's a certainty, and I think President Donald Trump is probably more realistic and pragmatic than we would think, and I don't think he will jeopardize the US economy. When we say these big groups are important, they bring a lot of money into the US economy, so big pharma make a really big contribution to the American economy. So there's a lot of discussion that's going on about tariffs, about drug prices. There's a lot of strong statements. Let's wait to see what happens, what's implemented. I'm very positive, although I hear the frustration and the tension that's there. Europe needs to build on its fundamentals, health, defense, technology. We have really good researchers. We're ahead of the game in terms of research. Let's turn them into big and important drugs made and marketed by our big European pharmaceutical groups. And when things shift and move, let's build on Europe's strengths in a certain number of areas. I'm going to hand back to Christian Saint-Etienne for a moment. I think it would be fair to hand back over to Kim one last time, just to get his response to some of the different things that have been said from the stage. Do you think that we are facing a real confrontation between Europe and America, or will we find a solution, negotiate a solution where everyone will find a place, and these transatlantic negotiations, do you think they'll go in the right direction? Do you think there'll be a confrontation, a kind of trade war between Europe and US, or do you think there will be an agreement? You're an advisor to the White House. What do you think?
But let me just come back to what I opened with, which is that the US and Europe, they share a common set of values and a common set of problems. And the way that the US government at the moment has chosen to go out and try to fix those problems may not be the same way that Europe might come at it. But to the extent that no one's working on this, and Europe has their own way of doing things, but I was in Paris last weekend and I saw a Chinese EV parked on the street. That EV represents thousands and thousands and thousands of euros of state subsidy, making that car almost impossible to compete with. Will you ask your domestic firms to compete with not a Chinese firm, but the resources of the Chinese government? Maybe, maybe not. But the US is taking action now to try to fix some of these problems. And I hope that Europe does too, and I hope that in the future we'll continue to work together to solve these global issues.
Merci. Le mot de la fin, l'analyse de Christian Saint-Etienne.
A final analysis from Christian Saint-Etienne to wrap up this panel. Before analysing what was said, I would like to ask a final question to Aurore LALUCQ and also to Kim RUHL, because he's not just a presidential advisor. We're really lucky to have him with us, in fact. But if you don't know what the Council of Economic Advisors is, there are 3 economic advisors who provide direct advice to the US president, and he's one of the 3. He's also an economist. Europe has a problem, and it would be great to hear Aurore talking about this first of all. USA is closing its doors to China. The risk for Europe is what Kim was just touching on. He reminded us that China are not playing by the same rules as us. The risk is that China dumps hundreds of billions of industrial outputs into Europe that they haven't been able to sell in the USA. Will Europe be able to respond quickly enough? The question for Kim in this regard is, what do you think as an economist about what might happen to Europe? 1 minute for Aurore. I very much agree with you. It's something that I highlight right at the start of my term as an MEP. We knew that Donald Trump was likely to be elected and what he was going to do and what the effects would be. So that's why the question of simplification, you can remove the CSRD regulation and all of these this legislation. It's not going to protect you from the Chinese market. Let me remind you of the China's 2050 strategy. It wants to strike down the European economy. So Europe needs to wake up. Europe needs an industrial strategy and do something that it doesn't like to do. It needs to get into protectionism, and Europe's going to need to be a bit more aggressive. Do you think the European Commission will be able to do it? It's up to all of us. Some of us are fighting for it morning, noon and night, but it's not part of the European DNA. As you know, Europe was built at a time when globalization was being rolled out and deepened, even facing the Inflation Reduction Act, which I thought was a good idea. We didn't respond properly. So Europe needs to shake itself up and wake itself up, otherwise other countries will do it. Kim, are you worried about Europe becoming an industrial colony of China? Is that your worry?
I think I'm worried that Europe faces the same problems that we have in the US. We've watched our industrial base be chipped away by non-market actors, and it's created very heterogeneous effects within our country, both across different types of jobs that have been lost and geographically in different places that have been hit harder than others. And that can create social problems. And I believe those are the same types of problems that people are worried about in Europe. And so perhaps they'll see what the US has done and what we're trying to do to fix these problems. And in the end, the United States and Europe can become a counterweight to the non-market actors and the sort of malcontents that are trying to change the way the global economy works in a way that's worse for the United States and for Europe.
Merci. Christian,
en un mot,
Christian, in a word, the US has a very aggressive policy, but China's policy is even more aggressive. They are subsidizing their businesses to try and take control of the world market. In Europe, the solar panel production industry has been wiped out. They're trying to do the same thing for heat pumps, electrolyzers. They're trying to do the same thing with electric cars. And in some ways, the US are responding to the Chinese threat in a bit of a brutal way, but we're just watching what's going on. So, in a word, Europe has massive potential, but the question is, will it be able to take hold of its destiny? We need to respond to this not in 10 years, but in 18 months. And the question is, will a year down the line, when we get together here in Aix-en-Provence again, we have answers showing that Europe is starting to respond to the Chinese threat. I hope that we will have settled our differences with the USA by then. Thank you very much. Let's see you again next year in Aix. Thank you to all of our panelists.